what we have seen in shutting down these inquiries effectively, and in the attack that was mounted against Michelle Bachmann and these other four, what Newt Gingrich calls the National Security Five, is an effort to keep you and the Congress and the media from knowing what the Muslim Brotherhood is up to here. What do? You may remember this. Michelle Bachmann personally, and most specifically, was targeted for having raised questions about the woman. You can't see it here, but you've been perhaps seeing her recently because her husband was running for mayor of New York City, and she was going to become the first lady of New York if he had won. Fortunately, that didn't happen. But before she ran for first lady, she was running the State Department for Hillary Clinton. Her name is Homa Abedin. And she is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood and has been for the better part of 2 decades. Not just through her family, it turns out, but in her own right as well. But that story, that lady, particularly with all of the heartache about her husband's misconduct, became a subject of a very aggressive defense of her, attack on Michelle Bachmann and the others for the purposes, among other things, of suppressing these investigations and our knowledge of what's going on. This is contributing, I believe, to the problem we've got today that I talked about at the beginning and throughout. And I just want to leave you very quickly with a sense that it didn't start, unfortunately, with Barack Obama coming to office. And part of the problem that we have at the moment is as a result of what happened before he did. Okay, let's go to this slide. This is a kind of rhetorical question. Given what I've shown you in terms of the sustained, disciplined, systemic effort by the Muslim Brotherhood to undermine us from within in all of these civil society institutions and in our government, some would have you believe that somehow they overlook the conservative movement and the right. Next slide. That seems all the more improbable, doesn't it? Given that the conservative movement and the right was basically the prime mover behind stopping the last of these totalitarian ideologies that tried to destroy us from within and without in the Soviet communism. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it may shock you to know that they didn't overlook us. Next slide. The gentleman on the left partnered up with the gentleman on the right. Don't know if he's familiar to many of you or not. Grover Norquist, does that name ring a bell? Grover Norquist is known mostly because he is the chairman of a group, or president of a group called Americans for Tax Reform. Widely believed in our community as a great leader of the conservative movement, defender of all of us against red ink. That may be. But in 1998, he joined forces with a man who is currently serving hard time in federal prison on terrorism charges, and was a top Muslim Brotherhood operative at the time, and it turns out also a financier for Al-Qaeda, in creating something called the Islamic Free Market Institute, a Muslim Brotherhood front group whose purpose was to penetrate and subvert Republicans and conservatives, as they had previously done with the Clinton administration, who made this guy, among other things, the fellow who would select, train, and certify chaplains for the United States military and the U.S. prison system. How does that make you feel? Let me just quickly give you a sense of what happened as a result of this partnership. Next slide. You remember him. Next slide. Another 6 of these characters. Again, I won't go through all of them. I just want to show you some photographs to give you a sense of what transpired. Next slide. Abdurrahman al-Moudi with the then governor of Texas in the governor's mansion in Austin in May of 2000. Next slide. His right-hand man, Khalid Safouri, same meeting. Next slide. A man who now runs an organization called the Council on American Islamic Relations, one of the worst of the Muslim Brotherhood fronts, here with the then President of the United States shortly after 9/11, admiring the Islamic Center of Washington, one of those Muslim Brotherhood front mosques in Washington, D.C. Next slide. Sami El-Arian, a man who at the time this photograph was taken on the campaign trail with George and Laura Bush, was running Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a designated terrorist organization, from his professorship position in the University of South Florida. Next slide. One of the worst of the jihadist Sharia adherent imams in the United States, Ismail Siddiqui, shown here at the White House, presenting the president shortly after 9/11 with the Quran, prompting the president to talk about the Quran being a book of teachings of peace and good. Next slide. Finally, a fellow by the name of Suhail Khan, a man I consider to be one of the worst of the bunch because he's been one of the most successful thanks to his relationship with Grover Norquist. Next slide. Thanks to that relationship, Grover got him a job in Karl Rove's public liaison office in the White House, where he became the gatekeeper, enabling many of these photographs to be taken in the run-up to and after the 9/11 attacks. Next slide. A gatekeeper, as I mentioned. Next slide. These guys got, during this period, unprecedented access and influence, which I believe has contributed materially to the problem that we've got today, not least by precedent. Next slide. Now, interestingly enough, I mentioned the Americans for Tax Reform. As you may know, it not only operates in Washington, D.C., it has spawned so-called center-right coalitions all over the country. I believe they're starting one in Dallas, Texas, as we speak. They have one going in Austin, Texas. These are vehicles principally for conservatives to get together. Perhaps some of you have participated in them. But there are also opportunities for influence operations. Next slide. One of the groups that Grover and Suhail Khan have been active with is called Muslims for America. This is an interesting quote from one of the founders of the organizations. We've partnered with Americans for Tax Reform because they're looking for Muslim leaders to participate in their monthly coalition meetings, center-right coalition meetings, that also serve as political hotbeds for creating relations with top political leaders and Muslims. That's a little too much transparency, frankly. It shows what is being done, not just, again, in distant Washington, but right here in Texas. And let me give you an example that came to my attention personally not so long ago. Next slide. Well, I talked with this gal. Does anybody know Catherine Engelbrecht? I know Alice does. She's one of the great Texans, and for that matter, Americans of our time. You've probably heard about her lately because she got seriously whacked by the IRS and many of the other federal agencies that have been used to suppress folks like yourselves. She mentioned to me that her King Street Patriots, which she founded in Houston, Texas, was approached by Suhail Khan a year or so ago, saying that if she would make her group, quote, more inclusive, unquote, he could drive a lot of money her way. Next slide. She fortunately said no. Back to Mohammed El-Arian. I was at a meeting in Dallas a couple of months ago, conservative meeting. Mohammed El-Arian was in the room. Imagine my surprise. I said more or less what I've said here, though I didn't single him out by name, but did talk about Muslim Brotherhood influence operations, Grover Norquist, and so on. Praying that he would come out and rumble me, and he didn't. He just sat there fuming. At the end of the meeting, I asked the organizers, what was this Muslim brother doing in this conservative conclave in Dallas, Texas? And they said, oh, the center-right coalition recommended him. You seeing a pattern here? Next slide. I'll leave you just with this. We can talk about it more if you'd like. I know I'm over time, but there are things to be done. That course that I've mentioned, MuslimBrotherhoodAmerica.com, has an entire part 10 of the course that is directed to what we can do about this as individuals, as members of groups like this. Alice is a great leader on this score, and what we have to do collectively as citizens of this nation. I'll be happy to talk to you about some examples of that. Let me just give you one next slide. Here in Texas, we have been trying to get legislation adopted, as we have now successfully done in 9 other states. In the 9th of Missouri, it was just vetoed, and we failed in an override by 1 vote. But this legislation is called American Laws for American Courts. What a radical concept. Most of us think that's how it works, unless you've taken the trouble to look into it. We did at the Center for Security Policy. We've done a study, about to be updated, but this one a couple of years ago now, found 50 cases, just as a microcosm of American jurisprudence, 50 cases across the country in which somebody, the plaintiff or the defendant, tried to get Sharia used to adjudicate whatever the dispute was. Usually it was a family law problem. And in 27 of those 50 cases, in 23 different states, the court upheld the use of Sharia, usually to the extreme detriment of women, children, or both. You wouldn't think that could happen in America, would you? Let me give you a particularly graphic example. Born woman, Muslim, American citizen by naturalization, pleaded with a state judge for a protective order against her Moroccan husband because he was systematically torturing her and raping her. The judge ruled that he could not give her that protective order because he found no evidence of criminal intent. The man was just following what he believed to be his rights under Sharia. Fortunately, that was overturned quickly on appeal, but again, the point is, it's happening here, and more of it is happening here. And if we don't have something like American Laws for American Courts, you will find it happening more and more here, because that's part of the civilization jihad. If you're able, think about it, if you're able to create, basically, as they have in the United Kingdom now, parallel systems of justice, not only are you fundamentally affronting the Constitution of the United States, whose Article 6 says, as you probably know, the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. Well, suddenly there's another supreme law. And then you get to pick which one you want to be governed by. And oh, by the way, one doesn't give you the rights, or give somebody else the rights that the other does. So I would suggest to you that if you're looking for something to do, imagine you're here on a pretty Saturday morning because you're looking for something to do, I hope you'll add this to the list. We failed twice in the state legislature in Texas. You don't do this legislature thing very often here, it turns out, but we've now failed twice in the closing days of 2 consecutive sessions because basically somebody, and I happen to think Grover Norquist is at work here, but maybe I'm wrong, somebody in the dark of night deep sixes American Laws for American Courts and prevents it from being enacted when it would otherwise overwhelmingly be approved. Okay, last slide. I'll close with this. I had the privilege of working for President Reagan a long time ago. He said this when I was in Knickers in 1961. Freedom is never more than one generation from extinction. We don't pass it on to our children through the bloodstream. It has to be fought for, it has to be protected, and then passed on to them to do the same. Or we'll spend our sunset years telling our children, and our children's children, what it was like to live in America when men were free. I don't think you're in this room because you have that in mind for your sunset years.